In a small Wyoming town, a struggling restaurant owner, despite facing eviction, still opens her doors to everyone. And one stormy night, she serves a group of Hell's Angels who can't pay. Not knowing they're about to change everything, the next day, 150 motorcycles line up outside with a solution that will shake the entire town. But will it be enough to save the Rustler's stop, or will she lose everything she's fought for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled across the empty stretch of Highway 14, cutting through the sparse Wyoming landscape like a blade. Out here, where the plains stretched endlessly toward the mountains and the nearest neighbor was 20 miles down the road, the Rustler's stop stood like a defiant monument to survival. Its weathered wooden sign creaked on rusty hinges. The paint faded from years of sun and snow, but the lights inside still glowed warm against the gathering dusk. Grace Mitchell stood behind the counter, her hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm coffee, staring at the stack of envelopes she'd been avoiding all week. Past due notices, final warnings, a certified letter from Preston Caldwell's law office that she hadn't even opened yet because she already knew what it said. 3 months behind on rent. The building she'd poured her life into for the past 9 years didn't even belong to her. And the man who owned it had made it clear he was done waiting. She was 42 years old, a widow and running out of options. The Rustler's stop wasn't fancy. It never had been. The booths were cracked vinyl patched with duct tape, the linoleum floors scuffed from decades of work boots and spurs. The jukebox in the corner still played Conway Twitty and Patsy Cline if you kicked it just right. But the food was honest, the coffee was strong, and for the truckers, ranch hands, and travelers passing through this forgotten corner of Wyoming, it was home. Grace had bought the place with her late husband, Tom, back when they were young and stupid enough to believe hard work was all you needed. Tom had died 5 years ago, a heart attack out in the barn while fixing a fence. No warning, no goodbye, just gone. She'd kept the restaurant running because it was all she had left of him. Every burger flipped, every pot of chili stirred, every early morning spent prepping biscuits. It was her way of holding on, but holding on wasn't enough anymore. Kenny pushed through the kitchen door, wiping his hands on his apron. He was 63, built like a bear, with a gray beard that reached mid-chest and hands scarred from a lifetime of hard labor. He'd been her cook since the beginning, back when Tom was still alive. He worked for less than he deserved and never complained. "Slow night," he muttered, glancing at the empty dining room. Grace nodded. Yeah, it had been slow for months. The new highway bypass had rerouted most of the traffic, and the few locals who used to come in regularly were tightening their belts just like everyone else. She tried everything, daily specials, discounts, staying open later. Nothing worked. The world was changing, and small-town diners like hers were becoming relics. Kenny leaned against the counter, his voice quieter now. "You gonna open that letter?" Grace's eyes flicked to the envelope from Caldwell's office. She exhaled slowly. "Already know what it says. Maybe it's not as bad as you think." She gave him a look. Kenny had always been an optimist, even when there was no reason to be. She appreciated it, but right now, optimism felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. "It's an eviction notice, Kenny. Preston's been waiting for this. He's got some big development deal lined up and I'm in the way." Preston Caldwell owned half the commercial property in town. He was a transplant from California, one of those types who showed up with money and plans to revitalize rural America, which usually meant tearing down everything that made it worth living in and replacing it with cookie-cutter shops and overpriced condos. He'd been circling the Rustler's stop for 2 years, making offers that insulted her intelligence. When she refused to sell, he cranked up the rent. When she couldn't pay, he smiled and said he'd give her time. But that time had run out. Kenny scratched his beard. You could fight it. With what money? He didn't have an answer for that. Grace set her mug down and turned toward the window. Outside, the sky was bruising purple, storm clouds rolling in fast. The kind of storm that came out of nowhere and lasted all night. She could already hear the first drops of rain tapping against the glass, and then she saw them, headlights. Not just one or two, but a line of them cutting through the rain like a procession. The low rumble of engines grew louder, a sound she felt in her chest before she fully registered what it was. Motorcycles. Kenny stepped up beside her, squinting through the window.
What the hell?
Grace's stomach tightened. She'd seen bikers pass through before, usually in small groups, stopping for coffee or pie before moving on. But this was different. This was a convoy. The bikes pulled into the gravel lot one by one, their engines growling as they parked in a rough semicircle facing the diner. Grace counted at least 15 of them, maybe more. The riders wore black leather, patches stitched across their backs. Even through the rain-streaked glass, she could make out the words, "Hell's Angels." Her breath caught. Kenny muttered a curse under his breath. "You want me to lock the door?" Grace's first instinct was to say yes. She'd heard the stories, same as everyone else. Hell's Angels weren't the kind of people you wanted trouble with. But then she looked closer. The riders weren't smashing windows or causing a scene. They were just sitting there, rain pouring down on them, waiting. One of them dismounted, a tall man with broad shoulders and a grey beard streaked with black. He pulled off his helmet, shook the water from his hair, and looked directly at the diner. His eyes met Grace's through the window. There was something in that look. Not aggression, not threat, weariness. Grace made a decision. "No," she said, her voice steady. "Unlock it." Kenny stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "Grace, they're soaked, Kenny, and I'm not turning people away." He hesitated, then sighed and flipped the lock. The man with the grey beard pushed the door open, and the bell above it chimed softly. He stepped inside, water dripping from his jacket onto the floor. Behind him, the rest of the riders filed in, silent and watchful. Grace straightened, forcing herself to meet his gaze without flinching. "Evening," she said. The man nodded. "Evening, ma'am." His voice was rough, like gravel underfoot, but not unkind. "Hope we're not intruding?" "Not at all," Grace replied, gesturing toward the empty booths. "Take a seat wherever you like." The bikers exchanged glances, then slowly began settling into the booths. They moved carefully, almost politely, as if they were used to being watched. Grace noticed the patches on their jackets, the insignia that marked them as members of one of the most notorious motorcycle clubs in the country. The man with the grey beard stayed at the counter. He set his helmet down and met her eyes again. "Name's Carl," he said. "Carl Ferguson. Folks call me Axel," Grace nodded. "Grace Mitchell. I run this place." Carl glanced around the diner, taking it all in. The worn booths, the faded photos on the walls, the smell of fresh coffee and old grease. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Reminds me of a place my old man used to take me," he said quietly. "Back before everything got complicated." Grace didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded. Carl cleared his throat. "We've been riding all day. Got caught in the storm. Just looking for some hot food and a place to sit for a bit." Grace pulled out her order pad. "What can I get you?" And just like that, the tension in the room eased. The bikers ordered burgers, fries, coffee, pie. Kenny disappeared into the kitchen, and Grace got to work. For the next hour, the Rustler's stop was alive again, filled with the sound of conversation and clinking silverware. Grace moved between tables, refilling coffee cups and checking on orders. The bikers were surprisingly respectful. They said please and thank you, wiped down their tables, and left generous tips in crumpled bills. But as the night wore on and the rain continued to pour, Grace noticed something. Carl had been sitting at the counter the entire time, nursing the same cup of coffee. When she brought the check, he didn't reach for his wallet. He just looked at her. "Ma'am," he said quietly. "I need to be honest with you." Grace's chest tightened. "Here it comes." Carl exhaled slowly. "We're broke. Spent our last cash on gas just to get here. I can't pay for this." Grace stared at him. Behind her, Kenny had stopped moving. The other bikers had gone quiet, watching. Carl's jaw tightened. "I know how this looks, but I swear to you, we're not here to cause trouble. We'll work it off if you want. Wash dishes, clean up, whatever you need." Grace looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the kind that came from more than just a long ride. She saw pride struggling against shame, and she made another decision. "Forget it," she said. Carl blinked. "What?" I said. "Forget it." Grace tore the check in half and dropped it into the trash. "You came in here cold and hungry. I fed you. That's the end of it." Carl stared at her, something unreadable flickering across his face. "Why?" Grace shrugged. "Because it's the right thing to do." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Carl stood, extending his hand. Grace shook it. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. Grace nodded. "You're welcome." The bikers filed out one by one, engines roaring back to life as they disappeared into the rain. Carl was the last to leave. He paused at the door, looking back at her. "I won't forget this," he said, and then he was gone. Grace locked the door behind them and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. Kenny appeared from the kitchen, shaking his head. "You just fed 15 Hell's Angels for free," he said. Grace smiled faintly. "Yeah, I did." She didn't know it yet, but that decision would change everything. The morning after the storm, Grace woke to sunlight streaming through her bedroom window and the dull ache of exhaustion in her bones. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying the night before on an endless loop. The roar of motorcycles, Carl Ferguson's weathered face, the weight of his handshake. She pulled herself out of bed and dressed quickly, her body moving on autopilot. The drive to the Rustler stop took 20 minutes down empty roads, the landscape still damp from last night's downpour. Puddles reflected the morning sky, and the air smelled clean, scrubbed raw by the rain. When she pulled into the gravel lot, she noticed something immediately. Tire tracks. Deep grooves carved into the mud where the motorcycles had been parked. Evidence that last night had been real, not some fever dream brought on by stress and unpaid bills. Grace unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The diner smelled like coffee and old grease, familiar and comforting. She moved through her morning routine without thinking, flipping on the lights, starting the coffee maker, preheating the griddle. Kenny would arrive in an hour, and by then she needed to have the prep work done. But as she tied her apron and reached for the order pad, her eyes landed on the counter. There was something there that hadn't been there last night, a leather wallet. Grace frowned, picking it up. It was worn, the kind that had been carried for years, shaped by time and use. She opened it carefully, half expecting to find cash or credit cards. Instead, she found a business card, Carl Axel Ferguson. The name was printed in simple black letters. Below it, a phone number, and beneath that, handwritten in blue ink, "Thank you for your kindness." "I owe you one." Grace stared at the card, her chest tightening. He'd left it deliberately. A promise, maybe, or just a way of saying he wasn't the kind of man who forgot a debt. She slipped the card into her pocket and tried to push the thought away. She had bigger problems to deal with. The certified letter from Preston Caldwell's office was still sitting on the counter, unopened. Grace had avoided it long enough. She picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly, and tore it open. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Notice of lease termination failure. To remit payment within 30 days will result in immediate eviction proceedings. 30 days. Grace set the letter down carefully, her hands flat against the counter to steady herself. 30 days to come up with 3 months of back rent plus late fees. 30 days before Preston Caldwell showed up with a sheriff and locked her out of the only thing she had left. She closed her eyes and took a slow breath. She wouldn't cry, not here. Not now. The bell above the door chimed, and Grace looked up, quickly wiping at her eyes. A customer. She forced a smile, ready to greet whoever had walked in. But it wasn't a customer. It was Preston Caldwell. He stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that looked absurd in a place like this. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good morning, Grace," he said smoothly, stepping inside. Grace straightened, her smile disappearing. "Preston!" He glanced around the diner with the kind of detached interest a man might show when inspecting a condemned building. "I trust you received my letter." "I did." "Good." He clasped his hands behind his back, rocking slightly on his heels. "I wanted to give you the courtesy of a personal visit. Make sure you understand the situation. Grace's jaw tightened. I understand perfectly. Preston tilted his head, his expression one of practiced sympathy. I don't think you do. This isn't personal, Grace, it's business. You're 3 months behind on rent. You've made no effort to catch up. I've been more than patient. I've been trying. Trying isn't good enough. His voice sharpened, the polite veneer cracking slightly. I have investors breathing down my neck. This property is part of a larger development deal, and I can't afford to have you dragging your feet. Grace's hands curled into fists at her sides. This isn't just property, Preston. This is my life. He shrugged, unmoved. Then maybe you should have managed it better. The words hung in the air, cold and cutting. Grace felt her face flush with anger, but she bit her tongue. Losing her temper wouldn't change anything. Preston pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and set it on the counter. I'm offering you one last option. Sign this, and I'll buy the business outright. You walk away with a small payout, no eviction on your record. Clean break. Grace looked at the paper but didn't touch it. How much? 10,000. She let out a bitter laugh. 10,000. I put 9 years into this place. It's worth 10 times that. Preston's smile was thin. Not anymore. The bypass killed your foot traffic. Your customer base is drying up. Frankly, I'm being generous. Grace's chest burned with rage, but she kept her voice steady. I'm not signing. Preston sighed, picking up the paper and tucking it back into his pocket. Then you're making a mistake. In 30 days, you'll be out on the street with nothing. At least this way, you'd have something. He turned toward the door, then paused, glancing back at her. You know, Grace, I almost admire your stubbornness. But stubbornness doesn't pay the bills. And with that, he walked out. Grace stood there, trembling with anger and helplessness. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to do anything other than stand there feeling like a victim. The door opened again, and this time it was Kenny. He took one look at her face and frowned. What happened? Grace's voice was hollow. But Preston, he wants me out in 30 days. Kenny cursed under his breath. That son of a... It doesn't matter. Grace shook her head, forcing herself to move. We've got work to do. But as she turned back to the kitchen, her hand brushed against the pocket where Carl Ferguson's card was tucked away. Thank you for your kindness. I owe you one. She didn't know why, but something about those words stuck with her. The rest of the day passed in a blur. A handful of regulars came in for lunch, but the dining room never filled. Grace moved mechanically, taking orders, pouring coffee, forcing smiles she didn't feel. Kenny worked quietly in the kitchen, the sound of sizzling burgers and clattering pans, the only noise breaking the silence. By mid-afternoon, the diner was empty again. Grace sat in one of the booths, staring at the eviction notice spread out on the table in front of her. 30 days. She'd spent the last few hours running numbers in her head, trying to figure out how she could possibly come up with the money. She couldn't, even if she worked every day. Doubled her hours, cut every corner, it wouldn't be enough. The Rustler's stop was dying, and there was nothing she could do to save it. Grace pressed her palms against her eyes, fighting the exhaustion threatening to pull her under, and then she heard it, the rumble of engines, faint at first, then growing louder. Grace lifted her head, her heart skipping a beat. She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the empty highway. They were back, not just 15 bikes this time. Dozens of them. A convoy stretching down the road, engines growling in unison as they turned into the gravel lot. Grace's breath caught. She counted 20, 30, 40 bikes, more rolling in behind them. The riders dismounted, leather jackets gleaming in the afternoon sun, patches visible even from a distance, and at the front of the pack, removing his helmet and meeting her eyes through the window, was Carl Ferguson. He walked toward the diner, his expression serious but not unkind. Grace moved to the door and opened it before he could knock. "Carl," she said, her voice uncertain. He nodded. "Grace, we need to talk." She stepped aside, letting him in. The other riders stayed outside, engines idling, watching. Carl stood in the middle of the diner, hands resting on his belt, looking around like he was seeing it for the first time. Then he turned to her. "I told you I wouldn't forget what you did for us," he said quietly. "And I meant it." Grace's throat tightened. Carl, I appreciate that, but I know you're in trouble, he interrupted. Word travels fast in small towns. I heard about Preston Caldwell. Heard he's trying to push you out. Grace stiffened. How did you... Doesn't matter how I know. Carl's jaw tightened. What matters is that you helped us when you didn't have to. Now we're here to return the favor. Grace shook her head. I can't ask you to. You're not asking. Carl's voice was firm. I'm offering. Grace stared at him, her mind racing. What are you saying? Carl glanced toward the window, where the line of motorcycles sat waiting. Then he looked back at her, his eyes steady. I'm saying you're not fighting this alone anymore. Grace stared at Carl Ferguson, trying to process his words. Behind him, through the window, she could see the line of motorcycles stretching across the parking lot. 40, maybe 50 bikes. Riders in leather, arms crossed, waiting. I don't understand, she said slowly. What are you offering? Carl pulled out one of the stools at the counter and sat down, gesturing for her to do the same. Grace hesitated, then took the seat across from him. Kenny emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, eyes darting between them. Carl leaned forward, his forearms resting on the counter. Last night, you fed me and my brothers, when we had nothing to give you in return. You didn't ask questions. You didn't judge. You just did what was right. Grace nodded slowly. Anyone would have done the same. No, Carl's voice was firm. They wouldn't have. Trust me, we've been turned away from more places than I can count. People see the patches, they see the bikes, and they lock their doors, he paused. But you didn't, and that tells me everything I need to know about who you are. Grace's throat tightened. She didn't know what to say. Carl continued. I made some calls this morning. Found out about your situation. Preston Caldwell, the eviction notice, the development deal. His jaw tightened. I know his type. Vultures who circle small businesses until they can swoop in and pick the bones clean. Kenny spoke up from behind the counter. So what's the plan? You gonna talk him out of it? Carl let out a dry laugh. Men like Preston don't respond to talk, but they do respond to pressure, Grace frowned. What kind of pressure? Carl met her eyes. The kind that comes from people who don't back down. A chill ran through Grace. Carl, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I can't ask you to... You're not asking. Carl's voice was steady. I'm telling you what's going to happen. My club, we don't take kindly to people who prey on the vulnerable. And we sure as hell don't stand by when someone who showed us kindness is about to lose everything. Grace shook her head. This isn't your fight. Yes, it is. Carl's eyes were hard now, the kind of hardness that came from years of living by a code most people didn't understand. You helped us. That makes it our fight, Grace wanted to argue, but something in his tone told her it would be useless. She glanced at Kenny, who was watching Carl with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. What do you need from me? Grace asked quietly. Carl straightened. First, I need to know the numbers. How much do you owe? Grace hesitated, then pulled out the eviction notice and slid it across the counter. Carl scanned it, his expression darkening. 3 months' rent. Late fees, total of $18,000. He looked up at her. And he's offering you 10 to walk away. Grace nodded bitterly. Generous, right? Carl's jaw clenched. That's not generosity. That's robbery. He folded the paper and handed it back to her. Here's what we're going to do. I've got connections, people who owe me favors. We're going to raise the money to cover your back rent. Grace blinked. Raise it how? Fundraiser, rally, whatever you want to call it. Carl gestured toward the window. You see those bikes out there? Every one of those riders has a network. We spread the word, bring people in, get the community involved. You'd be surprised how fast 18,000 can come together when people care. Grace felt a flicker of hope, quickly followed by doubt. Preston won't care if I pay the back rent. He wants this property for his development deal. He'll just find another reason to kick me out. Not if you've got a lease, Carl said. I do have a lease, month to month. Carl shook his head. That's the problem. Month to month gives him all the power. You need a long-term lease, something that legally protects you. Grace let out a bitter laugh. Preston's not going to give me that. He wants me gone. Then we make him. Carl's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. We pay off the debt. We get the community behind you, and we make it very clear that forcing you out is going to cost him more than it's worth." Kenny crossed his arms. "You really think that'll work?" Carl looked at him. "I think men like Preston Caldwell care about two things, money and reputation. If we hit both, he'll back off." Grace wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him. But she'd spent too many years watching the world work against people like her to think it would be that simple. "What if it doesn't work?" she asked quietly. Carl's expression softened. "Then at least you'll know you didn't go down without a fight." Grace exhaled slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the counter. She thought about Tom, about the years they'd spent building this place from nothing. She thought about the regulars who'd been coming here for years, the memories soaked into every booth and table. She thought about giving up, walking away, letting Preston Caldwell turn the Rustler's stop into another soulless piece of his empire. And she realized she couldn't. "Okay," she said, her voice steady. "Let's do it." Carl nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. "Good. We start today." He stood and walked to the door, opening it and stepping outside. Grace and Kenny followed, standing in the doorway as Carl raised his hand. The engines cut off one by one, and the riders dismounted, gathering around. Carl's voice carried across the lot. "Brothers, this woman right here fed us when we had nothing. Now she's about to lose everything because some rich bastard wants to line his pockets. We're going to help her. We're going to organize a rally, bring people in, raise the money she needs. And we're going to show Preston Caldwell that he picked the wrong woman to mess with." A cheer went up from the riders, fists raised in solidarity. Grace felt her chest tighten with emotion. She hadn't asked for this, but standing there, watching these men and women who barely knew her rally to her defense, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Over the next few hours, the Rustler's stop transformed into a command center. Riders pulled out phones, making calls, spreading the word. Someone set up a donation page online. Another rider, a woman named Vicky with short cropped hair and a sleeve of tattoos, started designing flyers. "We'll plaster these all over town," she said, showing Grace a mock-up on her phone. "Save the Rustler's stop. Rally this Saturday. Food, music, rides. People love that stuff." Grace nodded, overwhelmed. "I don't know how to thank you," Vicky shrugged. "Don't thank us yet. We've got work to do." By late afternoon, the first donations started trickling in. $50 here, $100 there. Small amounts, but they added up. Grace watched the numbers climb on the fundraising page, her heart pounding. And then the phone rang. Grace picked it up, expecting a regular or maybe a supplier. Instead, she heard a voice she recognized immediately. Preston Caldwell. "Grace." His tone was cold. "I'm hearing some interesting rumors. Something about a motorcycle rally." Grace's stomach tightened. "Word travels fast." "It does." Preston's voice was clipped. "I'm going to be very clear with you, Grace. Whatever stunt you're planning, it's not going to change anything. You're still 3 months behind on rent, and in 30 days, you're out. End of story." Grace gripped the phone tighter. "We'll see about that." Preston let out a humorless laugh. "You think a bunch of bikers and some online donations are going to save you? This is business, Grace, and business doesn't care about your little community fundraiser." "Maybe not," Grace said, her voice steady. "But people do." There was a long pause. Then Preston's voice dropped, cold and threatening. "I'm warning you, Grace, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Sign the papers, take the money, and walk away. Because if you keep fighting me, I will bury you." Grace's heart pounded, but she didn't flinch. "I guess we'll find out." She hung up. Kenny stared at her. "That was him?" Grace nodded, her hands shaking slightly. "He knows about the rally, and he's not happy." Carl, who had been listening nearby, stepped forward. "Good. Let him be unhappy." But Grace could see the concern in his eyes. Preston Caldwell wasn't the kind of man who made idle threats. If he said he'd bury her, he meant it. The door opened, and a regular named Ed walked in, a weathered rancher who'd been coming to the Rustler's stop for years. He glanced at the motorcycles outside, then at Grace. "Heard you're in some trouble," he said gruffly. Grace nodded. "Yeah, Preston's trying to force me out," Ed grunted. "Figured as much. That man's been a pain in everyone's ass since he showed up. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled wad of bills. "Ain't much, but it's what I got." Grace's eyes stung. "Ed, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He set the money on the counter. "But I want to. This place matters." Grace swallowed hard, nodding. "Thank you." As Ed left, Grace looked down at the cash. $200. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but it was something. Carl stepped beside her. "See, people care." Grace nodded, but the weight of Preston's threat still pressed down on her. 30 days, a rally, a fundraiser. It all felt like too little, too late. But she couldn't give up now, not when so many people were fighting for her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind. Grace barely slept, running on adrenaline and coffee as the Rustlers' stop transformed from a dying diner into the center of something bigger than she'd ever imagined. Carl and his crew worked like a well-oiled machine. They'd coordinated rallies before, fundraisers for causes they believed in, and they brought that experience to bear now. Flyers appeared on every telephone pole and storefront window in town. The social media pages Vicky had set up were flooded with shares and comments. Local news stations started calling, asking for interviews. Grace stood behind the counter on Thursday morning, staring at her phone in disbelief. The fundraising page had crossed $10,000. 10,000 from people she'd never met, scattered across the state and beyond. Some donations were $5, others $100. Each one came with a message. "Hang in there. Small businesses matter. Don't let them win." Kenny emerged from the kitchen with a fresh pot of coffee, his face showing the exhaustion they all felt. "You seeing this?" Grace nodded, her throat tight. "I can't believe it. Believe it." Carl's voice came from behind her. He'd just walked in, his leather jacket damp from the morning mist. People respond when they see someone fighting for something real. Grace set her phone down. "We're still 8,000 short. And the rally's in 2 days." Carl poured himself a cup of coffee. "The rally will get us there. Trust me." Grace wanted to trust him, but every time she closed her eyes, she heard Preston Caldwell's voice on the phone. "I will bury you." The door opened, and a woman Grace didn't recognize stepped inside. She was in her 50s, well-dressed with sharp eyes that took in everything at once. She walked straight to the counter. "Grace Mitchell." Grace straightened. "That's me." The woman extended her hand. "Linda Ferris. I'm a reporter with the Wyoming Tribune." Grace shook her hand cautiously. "What can I do for you?" Linda pulled out a small notebook. "I'm doing a story on your situation. Small business owner fighting against corporate development. It's a narrative people are interested in." She glanced at Carl. "Especially with the Hells Angels involved." Grace tensed. The last thing she needed was negative press about bikers taking over her restaurant. Carl seemed to read her thoughts. He set his coffee down and met Linda's gaze. "We're here because Grace helped us when she didn't have to. We're returning the favor." "That's the story," Linda made a note. "And Preston Caldwell? What's your response to his claim that Ms. Mitchell simply failed to manage her business properly?" Grace's jaw tightened. "Preston can claim whatever he wants. The truth is, he's been trying to push me out for years. The rent increases, the threats, the lowball buyout offer. This isn't about business management. It's about a man who wants this property and doesn't care who he has to crush to get it." Linda scribbled quickly. "Strong words. Can you prove any of that?" Grace hesitated. She had suspicions, but proof was another matter. Carl spoke up. "I've been asking around. Preston Caldwell's got a history of this. 3 other small businesses in the last 5 years, all forced out to make way for his developments. You want proof? Talk to Maria Santos. She ran a bakery on 5th Street until Caldwell tripled her rent and evicted her when she couldn't pay." Linda's eyebrows rose. "You have contact information for Miss Santos?" Carl pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. "I'll send it to you," Linda smiled, clearly pleased. "This is exactly what I needed." "Thank you." She turned back to Grace. "The story runs tomorrow. Front page." After Linda left, Grace turned to Carl. "How did you know about Maria Santos?" Carl shrugged. "I told you. Word travels." And I've been doing my homework on Preston Caldwell. His expression darkened. The man's a predator. He finds vulnerable businesses, squeezes them until they break, then swoops in to pick up the pieces. He's done it before, and he'll keep doing it unless someone stops him. Grace felt a surge of anger mixed with determination. Then let's stop him. That evening, as Grace was closing up, her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Hello? Ms. Mitchell. The voice was smooth, professional. My name is Richard Vaughn. I'm an attorney. Grace's stomach dropped. If Preston sent you... I don't work for Preston Caldwell, Vaughn interrupted. I work for people who are interested in helping you. Grace frowned. What people? Let's just say they're investors who've taken an interest in your case. They've been following the fundraiser, the news coverage. They believe the Rustler's stop has potential, and they're willing to back that belief with capital. Grace's mind raced. What kind of capital? Enough to cover your back rent and then some. Enough to secure a long-term lease and make improvements to the property. In exchange, they'd like a small equity stake in the business. Minority ownership, 20%. You'd retain full operational control. It sounded too good to be true, which meant it probably was. Who are these investors? Grace asked carefully. Vaughn paused. I'm not at liberty to disclose that yet, but I can tell you they're legitimate, well-funded, and genuinely interested in preserving businesses like yours. Grace's instincts screamed caution. I need time to think about this, of course. But Ms. Mitchell, I should mention that my clients are prepared to move quickly. If you're interested, we could have contracts drawn up within 48 hours. That would give you the funds you need before your eviction deadline. Grace's heart pounded. This could solve everything. But it could also be another trap. I'll call you back, she said, and hung up before Vaughn could respond. She immediately dialed Carl. He answered on the second ring. What's wrong? Grace told him about the call. When she finished, there was a long silence. You think it's legitimate? She asked. Carl exhaled. Could be. Or it could be Preston trying a different angle. Offering you a deal that sounds good on paper but has strings attached. You sign those contracts, you might find yourself locked into something worse than what you've got now. So what do I do? Let me make some calls. I know people who can look into this Vaughn guy. Find out who he really represents. Don't sign anything until we know what we're dealing with. Grace nodded, even though he couldn't see her. Okay, Grace, Carl's voice softened. You're doing the right thing. Being cautious. Don't let desperation make you do something you'll regret. After they hung up, Grace sat alone in the darkened diner, the weight of everything pressing down on her. The fundraiser was climbing but still short. Preston was circling like a shark. And now mysterious investors were offering salvation with unknown strings attached. She thought about Tom, about what he would do. He'd always been the steady one, the one who saw through the bullshit and made the right call. She wished he was here now. The next morning, Friday, the Tribune story hit. Grace's phone started ringing before she even made it to the diner. Friends, customers, people she hadn't heard from in years, all calling to offer support. The fundraising page exploded, donations pouring in faster than she could track. By noon, they'd crossed $15,000. Carl showed up with news about Richard Vaughn. He's legitimate. Represents a venture capital firm out of Denver. They specialize in small business investments, rural development, that kind of thing. Grace felt a flicker of hope. So it's real? It's real, Carl confirmed. But here's the thing. They want 20% equity. That means they've got a say in how you run things. And if the business grows, they profit. A lot, Grace chewed her lip. Is that bad? Not necessarily. But it means you're giving up a piece of your independence. You need to decide if that's worth it. Grace looked around the diner. The place was packed, busier than it had been in months. People had come in after reading the Tribune story, wanting to show their support. She'd run out of pie twice already, and Kenny was scrambling to keep up with orders. This was what the Rustler's stop could be. What it should be, I'll think about it, she said finally. That night, as Grace locked up, she found Carl sitting on one of the motorcycles in the parking lot, staring up at the stars. Couldn't sleep? She asked. He shook his head. Thinking about tomorrow. The rally? Grace sat down on the curb beside him. You think it'll be enough? Carl was quiet for a moment. I think you've already won, Grace. Maybe not the way you expected, but you've won. Look at what's happened in the last week. The community's behind you. The press is on your side. People are fighting for you because you gave them something worth fighting for. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. I'm scared, Carl. What if it's not enough? What if Preston finds a way to take this all away? Carl looked down at her, his expression serious. Then we make sure he doesn't. And in that moment, Grace believed him. Tomorrow, everything would change. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and a crispness in the air that promised a perfect day. Grace stood in the parking lot of the Rustler's stop at 6 a.m., watching the sun creep over the horizon. The gravel lot had been transformed overnight. Volunteers had strung up lights, set up tables, and marked off areas for food vendors and merchandise. A small stage stood at one end. Borrowed from the local high school, it looked like a county fair, or a dream she was afraid to wake up from. Carl pulled up on his bike, helmet under his arm, his face showing the same lack of sleep Grace felt. You ready for this? Grace laughed nervously. I don't think I have a choice. You always have a choice, Carl said, his tone serious. But this is the right one. By 8 a.m., the first bikes started arriving. Not just Carl's crew, but clubs from across the state. Groups Grace had never heard of, wearing patches from Montana, Colorado, even South Dakota. They rolled in with a thunder that shook the ground, parking in neat rows that stretched down the highway. Grace stood at the entrance, overwhelmed. How did you get all these people here? Carl shrugged. Put the word out. When bikers hear about someone fighting against corporate bullies, they show up. It's what we do. By 10 a.m., the lot was packed. Not just bikers, but families, ranchers, truckers, townspeople who'd read the Tribune story and wanted to be part of something. Food trucks had set up along the perimeter, the smell of barbecue and fried dough filling the air. A local band was setting up on stage, tuning guitars and adjusting microphones. Kenny worked the grill inside the diner, pumping out burgers and fries as fast as humanly possible. Grace moved between tables, greeting people, shaking hands, thanking everyone who'd come. The donations kept rolling in, both online and in person. Cash dropped into jars, checks handed over with well wishes. By noon, they'd crossed $17,000. Grace allowed herself a moment of hope. They were close, so close. And then she saw him. Preston Caldwell stood at the edge of the parking lot, arms crossed, surveying the scene with cold calculation. He wasn't alone. Two men in suits flanked him, along with someone Grace recognized as the town's building inspector, Marcus Webb. Her stomach dropped. Carl appeared at her side instantly, following her gaze. That's him? Grace nodded. That's Preston. And that's the building inspector with him. Carl's jaw tightened. This is about to get ugly. Preston began walking toward the diner, his entourage following. People noticed, conversations dying down as heads turned. The festive atmosphere shifted, tension crackling through the air. Preston stopped in front of Grace, his expression one of practiced concern. Grace, quite the event you've put together here. Grace squared her shoulders. What do you want, Preston? He gestured around the lot. I'm here in an official capacity. As the property owner, I have concerns about this gathering. Fire code violations, health and safety issues, unauthorized use of the premises. He nodded toward Marcus Webb. Mr. Webb shares those concerns. Marcus looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting away from Grace's. She'd known him for years. He was a decent man, but he was also a man who could be pressured. Marcus, Grace said evenly. We got all the proper permits. Everything here is by the book. Marcus cleared his throat. Well, I'd still need to conduct an inspection. Make sure there are no violations. Preston's smile was thin. Of course. And given the number of people here, the potential hazards, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to shut this down immediately until a full inspection can be completed. Grace felt her heart hammering. You can't do that. I absolutely can, Preston said smoothly. This is my property, and I have every right to ensure it's being used safely and legally. Carl stepped forward, his presence suddenly dominating the space. You want to shut down a community fundraiser? In front of all these people? That's your play? Preston barely glanced at him. I don't know who you are, but this is between me and Ms. Mitchell. Wrong, Carl said, his voice like gravel. This stopped being just between you two the moment you decided to bully a woman trying to save her business. A crowd had gathered now, forming a loose circle around them. Grace could feel the weight of their attention, the tension building like a storm about to break. Preston's eyes narrowed. Are you threatening me? I'm stating facts, Carl replied calmly. You're trying to shut down a peaceful gathering because you're scared. Scared that Grace is going to raise the money she needs. Scared that she's going to fight back. Scared that people are going to see you for what you really are. Preston's face flushed. I don't have to listen to this. Marcus, shut it down. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Caldwell, I need to actually conduct the inspection first. Then conduct it, Preston snapped. And find violations. I'm sure there are plenty. The words hung in the air, raw and damning. Grace saw Marcus's face change, saw the moment he realized what was being asked of him. Marcus took a step back. Mr. Caldwell, I can't fabricate violations. If the permits are in order, and there are no legitimate safety issues, I can't shut this down. Preston's expression went cold. Then perhaps we need to discuss your continued employment with the town. The threat was blatant, ugly. Grace felt anger surge through her, hot and fierce. But before she could speak, someone else did. That's enough, Grace turned. Ed, the rancher who'd donated money earlier in the week, stepped forward. Behind him, a dozen other locals formed a wall. Ed's voice was steady. Preston, you've been pushing people around in this town for too long. We've all stood by and watched because we didn't think we could do anything about it. But today, we're done watching. Preston's eyes darted between the crowd and Ed. You're making a mistake. No, Ed said. You are. For a long moment, no one moved. The air was electric, charged with the potential for something to break. Grace held her breath. Preston's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his expression shifting from anger to something harder to read. He looked back at Grace, his voice low and venomous. This isn't over. Then he turned and walked away, his entourage trailing behind him. Marcus lingered for a moment, meeting Grace's eyes with what looked like an apology before he too left. The crowd erupted in cheers. People clapped Ed on the back, shook Carl's hand, surrounded Grace with words of support. But Grace couldn't shake the feeling in her gut. Preston Caldwell didn't give up that easily. Carl pulled her aside as the crowd dispersed back to the festivities. You okay? Grace nodded, but her hands were shaking. He's going to come back harder. You know that, right? I know, Carl said. But you've got something he doesn't. You've got people who believe in you. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. The band played, people danced. Donations continued to pour in. By 4 p.m., the fundraiser had crossed $20,000, more than enough to cover the back rent. Grace stood on the stage, microphone in hand, tears streaming down her face as she thanked everyone. The crowd cheered, a sea of faces united by something simple and powerful, the belief that small businesses mattered, that communities mattered, that people like Grace deserved to fight and win. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Grace allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they'd done it. But as she turned to head back inside, she saw Vicky running toward her, phone in hand. Her face pale. Grace, Vicky said breathlessly, we've got a problem. Grace's heart sank. What is it? Vicky turned her phone around. On the screen was a news alert from the local station. Breaking. Fire marshal issues emergency closure order for the Rustler's stop. Safety violations cited. Grace stared at the words, her blood running cold. That's impossible. We just passed inspection last month, Vicky scrolled down. The order was issued an hour ago. Signed by the fire marshal himself. Effective immediately. Carl appeared beside them, reading over Grace's shoulder. His expression darkened. Preston! Grace felt her knees weaken. They'd raised the money. They'd won the community's support. But Preston had found another angle, another way to destroy her. "He's not going to let me win," Grace whispered. "No matter what I do." Carl gripped her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Then we escalate," Grace blinked. "What?" Carl's voice was hard, determined. "If Preston wants a war, we give him one. But we do it smart. We do it loud. And we make damn sure the whole state is watching." Grace looked at the crowd, at the people who'd spent their day fighting for her. She thought about Tom, about the years they'd built this place together. She thought about giving up, and then she thought about what Carl had said. "You always have a choice." She made hers. "Let's do it," she said. Carl nodded. "Then get ready, because tomorrow we bring everything we've got." Sunday morning dawned gray and cold, clouds rolling in from the mountains like a bad omen. Grace hadn't slept. She'd spent the night in the diner with Carl, Vicky, Kenny, and a handful of others, planning their next move. The fire marshal's closure order sat on the counter like a death sentence, but Grace refused to look at it anymore. Carl had made dozens of calls through the night, reaching out to contacts across the state. Lawyers, journalists, activists, anyone who might help. By dawn, they had a plan. It was risky, maybe even reckless, but it was all they had left. "We're going public," Carl had said. "Full press conference. We lay out everything Preston's done, every dirty trick, every threat. We make this so visible that he can't hide behind lawyers and officials anymore." Grace had agreed. But now, standing in the parking lot as the sun struggled to break through the clouds, she felt the weight of what they were about to do. At 9 a.m., the motorcycles started arriving. Not dozens this time, hundreds. They came from every direction, engines roaring like thunder, converging on the Rustler's stop in waves. Grace stood frozen, watching the endless stream of bikes pour into the lot, onto the highway, filling every available space. Carl appeared beside her, his face grim but determined. "I put the word out last night. Every club within 500 miles. This is what we can do when we stand together." Grace's throat tightened. She counted 50 bikes, then 100, then stopped counting. The sound was deafening, overwhelming, a wall of noise that announced to the entire town that something was happening. By 10 a.m., news vans had arrived. Local stations, regional outlets, even a crew from a national network. Carl had leaked the story overnight, framing it as a David versus Goliath battle, small-town business owner versus corporate developer, with the Hells Angels riding to her defense. It was the kind of story that wrote itself. Grace stood on the makeshift stage, microphone in hand, staring out at a sea of faces. Bikers in leather, townspeople wrapped in jackets against the cold. Cameras pointed at her like weapons. Her heart hammered, but she forced herself to breathe. Carl stood just off stage, nodding at her. "You've got this." Grace cleared her throat, her voice crackling through the speakers. "My name is Grace Mitchell. 9 years ago, my husband and I opened the Rustler's Stop because we believed this town needed a place where people could feel at home, where truck drivers and ranch hands and families could sit down, share a meal, and be treated with respect." She paused, steadying herself. "Yesterday, we raised over $20,000, enough to cover the back rent that Preston Caldwell claimed was the reason for my eviction. But last night, he had the fire marshal issue an emergency closure order. Violations that didn't exist last month suddenly appeared. Why? Because Preston doesn't want my money. He wants this property," the crowd murmured, anger rippling through them. Grace continued, her voice stronger now. "This isn't about one diner. It's about what happens when people with power decide that the rest of us don't matter. It's about communities being erased so developers can build condos and chain restaurants that have no soul, no history, no connection to the people who actually live here." She looked directly at the cameras. "Preston Caldwell has done this before. He's forced out 3 other businesses in the last 5 years. He's a predator, and he's counting on us to be too scared or too tired to fight back." Grace's hands tightened on the microphone. "Well, I'm done being scared. And I'm not backing down." The crowd erupted in cheers, engines revving in solidarity. Grace stepped back, her legs shaking, and Carl took the stage. His voice cut through the noise like a blade. We're here because Grace Mitchell fed us when we had nothing. She didn't judge us. She didn't turn us away. She did what was right. And now we're here to return the favor." He gestured toward the mass of motorcycles. "You see these bikes? Every single one of them represents someone who believes that people like Grace deserve to fight and win. We're not leaving until this closure order is rescinded and Grace gets a fair shot at saving her business." More cheers, more engines, and then, cutting through the chaos, a voice from a megaphone. "This is an unlawful assembly. You are ordered to disperse immediately." Grace's heart stopped. She turned to see 3 sheriff's vehicles pulling up, lights flashing. Deputies climbed out, hands resting on their belts. At the front of the convoy was Preston Caldwell, his face a mask of cold satisfaction. The crowd went silent, tension crackling like electricity. Preston stepped forward, megaphone in hand. "This gathering is in violation of the emergency closure order. Anyone who refuses to leave will be arrested for trespassing." Carl descended from the stage, walking slowly toward Preston. The deputies tensed, but Carl's hands were visible, his movements deliberate and calm. "You really want to do this?" Carl said, his voice low enough that only Preston and those nearby could hear. "You want to arrest 200 people on camera for supporting a small business owner?" Preston's smile was thin. "I want to enforce the law." "The law," Carl repeated. "The same law you've been bending and breaking to get what you want?" Preston's eyes narrowed. "Careful. That sounds like slander." "It's only slander if it's not true," Carl shot back. Grace stepped down from the stage, moving to stand beside Carl. Her voice was steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Preston, why are you doing this? Why do you hate me so much?" Preston turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I don't hate you, Grace. I don't think about you at all. This is just business." "Business," Grace repeated, her voice rising. "You're destroying people's lives for business." "I'm creating jobs, development, progress," Preston said coldly. "You're clinging to the past. This town doesn't need another failing diner. It needs investment, modernization. It needs heart," Grace interrupted. "Something you wouldn't understand." Preston's jaw tightened. "You've got 30 seconds to clear this lot, or I'm having every single one of you arrested." The crowd bristled, bikers revving engines in defiance. Grace felt the situation spiraling, violence simmering just beneath the surface. She couldn't let this turn into a riot. Not for her. She raised her hands. "Everyone, please," and then a voice cut through the chaos. "Stop," Grace turned. A woman was pushing through the crowd, elderly but moving with purpose. She wore a simple dress and carried herself with quiet authority. It took Grace a moment to recognize her Margaret Caldwell, Preston's mother. Preston's face went pale. "Mother, what are you—" "Be quiet, Preston," Margaret said sharply. She stopped in front of him, her eyes blazing. "I've been hearing about what you've been doing." I didn't want to believe it. "But I can't ignore it anymore." Preston's voice was tight. "This isn't your concern. You're my son," Margaret said. "Everything you do is my concern." She turned to Grace. "I'm sorry for what my son has put you through. He wasn't raised to be this way." Grace didn't know what to say. Margaret turned back to Preston. "Your father built this town. He believed in helping people, not crushing them. And now you're using his money, his legacy, to destroy everything he stood for." "I'm building a future," Preston said, his voice strained. "You're building an empire on the backs of people who can't fight back," Margaret said. "And I won't stand for it." She pulled an envelope from her purse and handed it to Grace. "This is the deed to the property. I'm transferring ownership to you. No strings attached." Grace stared at the envelope, her mind reeling. "I don't understand." Margaret's voice softened. "My late husband left me a share of Preston's holdings, including this property. I'm exercising my right to transfer it." She looked at Preston. "You can contest it if you want. But I have excellent lawyers, and I promise you I will win." Preston's face was a mask of fury and humiliation. "You're making a mistake." "No," Margaret said quietly. "I'm correcting one." She turned and walked away, leaving Preston standing alone, the wind knocked out of his sails. The crowd erupted in cheers, the sound deafening. Grace clutched the envelope, tears streaming down her face. Carl put a hand on her shoulder, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. Preston stood there for a moment longer, then turned without a word and got into his vehicle. The deputies followed, and within minutes they were gone. Grace looked out at the crowd, at the faces of people who'd stood with her, fought for her, believed in her. She raised the envelope above her head. "We did it," she said, her voice breaking. "We actually did it." The roar that followed shook the ground. The days that followed felt like a dream Grace was afraid to wake up from. The closure order was rescinded within hours, the fire marshal quietly admitting that the violations had been overstated. The story went viral, picked up by news outlets across the country. Small-town business owner saved by Hell's Angels and the developer's own mother. It was the kind of feel-good story that people couldn't get enough of. Grace's phone rang constantly. Interview requests, speaking invitations, offers of support from businesses and organizations she'd never heard of. The fundraising page, which had already exceeded its goal, continued climbing. By Wednesday it had reached $35,000, more than enough to not just pay the back rent, but to make real improvements to the Rustler's stop. Grace stood in the diner on Thursday morning, watching Kenny work the grill. The place was packed, busier than it had been in years. Every booth filled, people waiting by the door. Some were regulars, but many were newcomers who'd heard the story and wanted to be part of it. Carl sat at the counter, nursing his third cup of coffee. He'd stayed in town, helping Grace navigate the chaos of sudden attention. Vicky had taken over social media management, turning the Rustler's stop into a brand people recognized across the state. "You ever think your life would look like this?" Carl asked, gesturing around the crowded diner. Grace laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in months. "Never. A week ago I thought I was losing everything. Now I own the building, have more money than I know what to do with, and apparently I'm some kind of folk hero." Carl smiled. "You were always a hero, Grace. People just needed to see it." Grace's expression softened. "I couldn't have done this without you. Without all of you. We just gave you the tools," Carl said. "You did the fighting!" The door opened and Margaret Caldwell walked in. The diner went quiet for a moment, conversations pausing as people recognized her. Grace stood, moving around the counter to greet her. "Mrs. Caldwell," Grace said. "I wasn't expecting you," Margaret smiled warmly. "Please call me Margaret. And I wanted to check on you, see how you're doing." Grace led her to a booth, and Kenny brought over 2 cups of coffee without being asked. Margaret took a sip, her eyes brightening. "This is excellent," she said. "Thank you," Grace replied. She hesitated, then spoke. "I still can't believe what you did. Giving me the property. You didn't have to do that." Margaret set her cup down, her expression serious. "Yes, I did. My son forgot who he was supposed to be. He forgot that real wealth isn't measured in properties or developments, but in the lives we touch and the communities we build." She looked around the diner. "You understand that. You've always understood that." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm just trying to keep my mother's legacy alive, and my husband's, and you're succeeding," Margaret said gently. She reached across the table and squeezed Grace's hand. "Don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise." After Margaret left, Grace returned to the counter. Carl was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked. "You're going to be okay," he said simply. "Better than okay," Grace nodded, finally allowing herself to believe it. That weekend, the Rustler's stop held a celebration. Not a fundraiser this time, just a party. The entire town showed up, along with many of the bikers who'd stood with Grace. Tables were set up outside, music played, and for the first time in years, Grace allowed herself to just enjoy the moment. Ed, the rancher, pulled her aside as the sun began to set. "You did good, Grace. Tom would be proud." Grace's throat tightened. "Thank you, Ed. That means everything." As the evening wore on, Grace found herself standing alone for a moment, looking out at the crowd. Families laughing, kids running around, bikers swapping stories with ranchers. This was what community looked like. Messy, complicated, beautiful. Carl appeared beside her, 2 beers in hand. He offered her one and she took it. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked. Grace considered the question. "I want to expand, add more seating, update the kitchen. Maybe hire some more staff so Kenny and I aren't running ourselves into the ground." Carl nodded. "Sounds like a plan." And I want to do more, Grace continued, her voice growing stronger. I want to help other small businesses, people facing the same thing I faced. Maybe start a fund, offer support, connect them with resources. Carl smiled. Now you're thinking big. Grace looked at him. I learned from the best. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the celebration unfold. Carl, Grace said quietly. What you did for me, what you all did, I'll never forget it. But I have to ask, why? Why did you care so much about helping me? Carl took a long sip of his beer before answering. You know what people see when they look at us? The patches, the bikes, the reputation. They see criminals, troublemakers, people to be afraid of. He turned to face her. But you didn't. You saw people. Hungry, tired people who needed help. And you helped us without asking for anything in return. He paused, his voice rougher now. That kind of kindness is rare, Grace. And when you find it, you protect it. You fight for it. Because the world needs more of it. Grace felt tears slip down her cheeks. Thank you, Carl, for everything. He nodded, then raised his beer. To fighting the good fight. Grace clinked her bottle against his. To fighting the good fight. As the party continued into the night, Grace felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the absence of struggle, but the knowledge that she wasn't facing it alone. That she had built something real, something worth fighting for. The Rustler's stop would continue. It would grow, evolve, face new challenges. But Grace was ready for whatever came next, because she'd learned the most important lesson of all. When you stand up for what's right, when you treat people with kindness and dignity, when you refuse to back down in the face of injustice, you discover that you're never truly alone. There are always people willing to stand with you, to fight beside you, to rev their engines and line up by the hundreds because they believe in what you represent. Hope, resilience, community. And that was worth more than any development deal could ever be. 3 months later, the Rustler's stop had been transformed. New booths, updated equipment, a fresh coat of paint. But the soul of the place remained unchanged. The same recipes, the same warmth, the same commitment to treating every person who walked through the door with respect. Grace hired 3 new staff members, including a young single mother who reminded her of herself years ago. Kenny trained a sous chef, finally getting the help he'd needed for years. The diner was profitable again, not just surviving but thriving, and every month on the last Saturday the bikes would line up. Carl and his crew, along with other clubs who'd become friends and allies. They'd have breakfast, swap stories, and remind Grace that she was part of something bigger than herself. A family, a brotherhood, a community bound not by blood but by shared values and mutual respect. One morning, as Grace unlocked the door and flipped the sign to open, she paused to look at the small plaque now mounted beside the entrance. The Rustler's Stoppist. 2016, where everyone belongs. She smiled, remembering the night Carl had first walked through that door. Soaked, exhausted, broke. She'd fed him because it was the right thing to do, and that simple act of kindness had changed everything. Grace stepped inside, the familiar smell of coffee and possibility greeting her. She tied her apron, turned on the lights, and got to work, because this was what she was meant to do. Not just serve food, but serve people. To create a place where everyone, from truckers to bikers to families passing through, could feel at home, and nothing, not eviction notices or corporate developers or closure orders, would ever take that away from her again. The Rustler's stop was more than a diner. It was proof that kindness matters, that communities can fight back, that ordinary people, when they stand together, can achieve extraordinary things. And Grace Mitchell, the woman who'd almost lost everything, had become a symbol of that truth. She was a fighter, a survivor, a beacon of hope for anyone who'd ever been told they didn't matter. And she was just getting started. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.